In many ways, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory of today owes its existence to Alvin Weinberg. He began working on the design of the graphite reactor, or the X-10 pile it was called, in Chicago, working with Eugene Wigner and others. This became the centerpiece facility for the lab and operated for almost 20 years after the war, doing science, discovering new isotopes, and really leading the way in some of the early work in the development of nuclear energy and nuclear physics. When the Atomic Energy Commission decided in 1947 to consolidate the work in the development of nuclear energy at the new Argonne National Lab, it was Alvin who played a key role in convincing most of the scientific staff to stay in place and see how that played out. He also worked with Walter Zinn, the director of Argonne, to undermine the AEC decision and make sure that both labs had strong roles not only in nuclear energy but in a lot of the science and engineering that went on along with it. It was Alvin who led the development of a mock-up of the materials testing reactor and then convinced the AC to convert it into an operating reactor. The low-intensity test reactor was an ancestor of today's light water reactors that power about 20% of the electric grid. Alvin also stimulated work on other reactor designs, including the molten salt reactor that's still of international interest today. It was Alvin's preoccupation with the long-term survival of ORNL that led to our efforts in environmental research, climate change, and non-nuclear energy. Already in the 70s, he was pushing for work on the carbon dioxide question. Although it's more than 40 years since Alvin Weinberg stepped down as ORNL director, he continues to have an influence. With our focus on the combination of basic and applied research, our interest on focusing on really big questions, and our desire to put our science and technology to work. For that reason, UT Patel is proud to sponsor this documentary.
In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the first nuclear chain reaction at the University of Chicago's Stagg Field, 78-year-old Alvin Weinberg addressed his colleagues from the wartime Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory. Only a few yards from where he attended his first class at the University of Chicago 51 years earlier, Weinberg spoke to the crowd. He said, 20 years have passed since, at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Philadelphia, I said, "We nuclear people have made a Faustian bargain with society. On the one hand, we offer an inexhaustible source of energy. An energy, when properly handled, is almost non-polluting. Whereas fossil fuel burners emit oxides of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur, there is no intrinsic reason why nuclear systems must emit any pollutant except heat and a trace of radioactivity. But the price that we demand of society for this magical source is both vigilance from and longevity of our social institutions that we are quite unaccustomed to." Alvin Weinberg was one of the world's foremost authorities on nuclear energy. He's been the director of a national laboratory, served as a science advisor to U.S. presidents and world leaders, and traveled the globe preaching his gospel of safe and efficient nuclear power. Alvin Martin Weinberg was born on a cold April morning in 1915 to Jacob and Emma Weinberg of Chicago, Illinois. His childhood was typical of a first-generation Jewish boy whose parents had emigrated from Russia. By the time of Alvin's birth, his father, who was a tailor, was the manager of a dress factory in Chicago. The Weinbergs lived in middle-class style until the Depression, when the family broke up. Emma Weinberg raised Alvin and his older sister Faye to recognize the importance of family and education. Alvin attended Roosevelt High School in Chicago, where he discovered an interest in mathematics and science. At the age of 16, in the fall of 1931, Alvin attended his first class at the University of Chicago. He had planned to study chemistry, but it wasn't long before he changed his area of study to physics.
He told me one story about how, I guess in college, he dropped a glass jug of hydrochloric acid on the floor. It shattered, and it was a big mess. And I think it was at that point that somebody said to him, you know, you might want to go into something that doesn't require so much hands-on experimentation.
Alvin's time at the University of Chicago was not only exciting, but also important. He became acquainted with some of the world's leading physicists and got involved in research being conducted there in nuclear energy. In 1939, Alvin received his PhD in mathematical biophysics. He had planned to leave Chicago to work at Columbia University in New York City, but the U.S. involvement in World War II derailed his plans. By 1941, America was mobilizing for war. Hitler had attacked the Soviet Union in June of that year, and many of Alvin's associates had left Chicago to work on other wartime projects across the country. Alvin decided to remain and work at the University of Chicago's metallurgical laboratory. He worked with Carl Eckert doing calculations involving diffusion. They were making progress when Eckert announced he was leaving Chicago to work at the Undersea Naval Laboratory in California. Alvin said that he could not carry on the work without Eckert's supervision, but in response to Alvin's concerns, Eckert replied, "Don't worry, Eugene Wigner is coming to Chicago." Eugene Wigner was a Hungarian-born theoretical physicist and mathematician who in 1963 received a Nobel Prize in physics. He had come to the United States in 1930 as a guest lecturer at Princeton University. When Wigner was recruited for the project at the University of Chicago, he and Alvin began a professional relationship and personal friendship that lasted until the end of their lives. In Weinberg's book, The First Nuclear Era, The Life and Times of a Technological Fixer, he said of Wigner, "From my very first meeting, I sensed that here was a theoretical physicist of an order I had never encountered before."
Eugene was really a physicist. He had a deep understanding of subtleties of physics that are beyond the knowledge or understanding of most people, including my father. My father was trained as a physicist. He was probably not, I would guess, a first-rate physicist.
And so Alvin became his physics assistant. And they developed a relationship that lasted entire lives.
Wigner was considerably older than Alvin. Wigner was a Hungarian with a strong Hungarian accent. And I remember people would ask him, "Do you pronounce your name Wigner, Professor Wigner?" And he said, "No, I pronounce it Wigner." And he very much wanted to be an American. But of course, he had such a strong accent that he could not say the letter W in its American form.
I didn't know him enough to understand this amazing intelligence, but in recent years I read a lot about him and other of the Hungarians, and of course they have an intelligence that the rest of us can't even understand. But he had continued to have a lot of influence on Alvin, and I don't know that Alvin would do anything very important without talking to him.
By the summer of 1942, the nuclear project, including the work being done in Chicago, had been placed under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. By September, Brigadier General Leslie Groves was assigned to head what was called the Manhattan District. General Groves had established several secret locations across the U.S. in order to beat the Germans in building an atomic bomb. One of those sites was located in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The primary mission of Oak Ridge was to produce the uranium-235, which would be used as the explosive core of the atomic bomb. Another mission was to prove that a pilot-scale uranium reactor, the graphite reactor, could produce plutonium, a second fissionable material. This reactor is what attracted Alvin to Oak Ridge. Wigner had taken a liking to Oak Ridge as a result of several visits there. He visualized the small lab in East Tennessee expanding into a full-fledged nuclear energy laboratory. It was more or less a foregone conclusion that Alvin would accompany Wigner to Oak Ridge. Alvin, his wife Marge, and their 2-year-old son David arrived at the Louisville and Nashville train station in Knoxville in May of 1945. Only 3 months after Alvin had moved his family to Oak Ridge, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, eventually ending World War II. However, prior to the atomic bomb blasts, there was concern within the nuclear inner circle about the wisdom of actually using the weapons. Many at Clinton laboratories were concerned with the question of whether or not to drop the bomb. Leo Szilard had circulated a petition at Chicago that offered 3 choices. First, use the bomb in the most effective military way. Second, demonstrate but don't use the bomb. Third, don't use the bomb. On one of his visits to Oak Ridge, Eugene Wigner brought Szilard's petition with him. Alvin, along with a majority of those who signed the petition, chose option number 2, demonstrate but don't use. Now that the war was over, the work of creating a laboratory in Oak Ridge solely dedicated to nuclear energy became Alvin and Wigner's mission. They determined that 3 goals were preeminent: establishing a training school, which would teach the elements of technology to a new generation of industrial and naval engineers; designing and constructing a high-flux pile as a step toward the development of a breeder reactor; and designing and constructing a small, high-temperature, gas-cooled reactor. For the next 26 years, Alvin would serve as the research director, associate director, and eventually the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Although Alvin's passion was the creation of efficient and safe nuclear reactors, he guided the lab's research on other areas of scientific study as well.
They say that an institution is a reflection of a man. The laboratory is a reflection of Alvin. He influenced everything. He wasn't just interested in reactors. He was interested in biology. That was one of his major interests there. And he took a strong role in helping to direct and guide the biology program. That was true of anything that came up that he thought was important.
Anything he was asked to do, if he accepted it, he took it seriously. One of his most influential early piece of work was he was an early advocate for scientific information and the problem of the overload of scientific information and the need for computerization of scientific information retrieval. He worked on that for, I think, a summer. And he told me that he became a hero ever after of librarians from that piece of work.
Dr. Weinberg was one of the ones who encouraged people with different capacities, different interests, getting together on a project and really making a difference in the progression of that project, because the people with a different orientation would come with unique ideas from each other, fit them together, and make the project really work well.
He's what I call the ideal kind of scientific leader. He picked people to do a job and gave them, in my case, a division. And as long as you did your job right, I mean, things went well. He never interfered. If you couldn't do your job, you quietly got moved around.
It wasn't that he had some kind of supernatural ability. It was more that he had a combination of sound judgment, enough technical expertise to understand what was important and what wasn't important, and a focus and tenacity and, I guess, self-confidence, so that if he saw something that seemed important to him, he would hone in on it and stay with it, and just stay with it.
Alvin's leadership skills, charisma, and personality all contributed to his ability to lead the lab in the direction he thought it needed to go. Although he maintained a professional demeanor between himself and his employees, at the same time, he was open and approachable.
He never wanted to be called Dr. Weinberg, and he never wanted any of his PhD employees to be called doctor. Everybody was Mr. or their first names. And that projected the sort of informality that I remember most about Dr. Weinberg.
I always held Dr. Weinberg in such respect. I wasn't afraid of him exactly, but it was only maybe a few years before he passed away that I would call him Alvin. He was always Dr. Weinberg.
Many of Alvin's employees admired him greatly. His confidence and presence overshadowed the fact that he was relatively short in stature.
So I left his office and I went down the hallway where his associates were and found several of them. In each case, I said, "Did you know Alvin was really short?" They looked startled at me. It never occurred to me that Alvin was short because we thought of him the way he seemed to us.
However, Alvin could also be very intimidating.
The big organizations would have a meeting every year or 6 months, and people would come in and describe what they would be doing. And Alvin would come to them all if he could. People would come because they wanted to hear what he asked and what he commented.
Alvin was sitting on the front row, and I was talking about Memphis, and I mentioned, and census tracts, and I mentioned that this tract started after the berm on such and such an avenue. When I first encountered that word berm, I didn't know what it was, but I looked it up, and it means a man-made hill. So I was giving this, and I mentioned that in the speech, and Alvin raised his hand and he said, "What is a berm?" And I thought, oh, thank God I was.
And Jake Northfield, one of our bright guys with a theoretical bent, he loved to come up with huge equations up there, fill up the screen with equation after equation, long, complicated. And so he got up there and he was saying, doing this and this and this, and he said, therefore, and he asked for the next slide. And Alvin said, wait a minute, Jake. He says, back up there, look at that third line up there. Isn't that e to the minus? Shouldn't that be a plus?
He would often say to someone, you know what? I find that what you're telling me so hard to believe that I'm not sure I believe it. Which is really a much nicer way of saying, those results are crazy.
Although Alvin eventually became comfortable with the role of lab director, early on he struggled with stage fright when having to address a large crowd.
He would give an annual report, I guess the state of the lab speech. He was apparently terrified the first time he gave one of these. This is before I remember, but I heard it from other people, especially my mother. I'm sure it's true. I remember before his first State of the Lab speech, he had a good stiff drink to try to get him through it, and it apparently was successful.
During his tenure at ORNL, Alvin was responsible for all its various programs. While developing a management style, he realized one of the best things he could do for the work being done at the lab was to allow and even encourage freedom to experiment and discover.
Alvin was interested in only important things. He would call them important, but we'd look at them, things that affected the United States or the world or a lot of people in it. And while I was running one of the programs, Alvin asked me to spend some time looking into something. And what I was doing was keeping us very busy. And he called me over one day and said, you don't seem to be getting very far on it. And I said, well, Alvin, I'm getting to it, but we're really busy with this. And he says, we must find time for the important things.
Alvin was a brilliant person. He was one of the two people that I've known in my life who could go straight to the heart of the issue. No matter how much cloud there was around it, how many issues there were around the issue, he could ask the one question that was most important in getting to the heart of the problem.
I recall once that Alvin Weinberg and I were having a philosophical conversation, and I mused out loud, "Doctor, what would be the greatest gift that science could give to mankind?" To my intense surprise, he said, "A cheap, effective way to cut rock." I looked at him sort of strange. He said, "We cut rock the same way we cut rock 2,000 years ago. And if we could find an effective way to cut rock, it would open up all sorts of opportunities."
But he wanted to do the important things. So you look at what Alvin's for, is how to provide energy for the world, how to provide continuous energy, the safety of reactors, things which were important. And that was what he was interested in at the laboratory. People who were not engaged in things that Alvin thought were important sometimes had their feelings hurt that he didn't pay as much attention.
In addition to his day-to-day duties of running the lab, Alvin was also mindful of the field of nuclear science and its future direction. During his lifetime, Alvin wrote more than 500 papers and 8 books, and created new phrases to describe what he thought was important.
I don't remember what he was writing, but Alvin used a number of terms, Faustian bargain, big science. There's a set of them. And he wrote a couple of books, and he put those terms in.
Although the lab was doing research in many areas, Alvin maintained that the central mission of ORNL was to show how to make and perfect safe nuclear reactors and radioisotopes that could be used to diagnose and treat medical diseases such as cancer. Under his leadership, ORNL constructed and operated 13 nuclear reactors, including the ORNL swimming pool reactor, the Oak Ridge Research Reactor, the high-flux isotope reactor, commonly known as HIFER, 2 molten salt reactors, and a reactor that was showcased at the United Nations Atoms for Peace Conference in Geneva, Switzerland in 1955. Alvin also was the first to publish and promote the concept of the pressurized water reactor, the world's first primary commercial nuclear power reactor. In fact, pressurized water reactors are largely responsible for 20% of the electricity used in the U.S. today. Upon coming to Oak Ridge, one of Alvin and Wigner's main objectives was to create a school of nuclear training. The Oak Ridge School of Reactor Technology began to educate scientists and engineers from around the world about nuclear energy. One of its students was Captain Hyman Rickover, who later became Admiral Rickover, the father of the U.S. nuclear Navy.
One of the key things that happened is Hyman Rickover came down, then Captain Rickover, with a bunch of Navy people, and while they were here, began to design what would be a nuclear reactor submarine. Rickover had in mind making what's called a gas-cooled reactor. Alvin persuaded him to create a water-cooled reactor, which was a very good thing.
Later, Alvin wrote of Rickover, "Rick, of course, had many qualities that made up for his unsophisticated command of the details of nuclear engineering. He was above all totally dedicated. He had complete confidence in himself, and he used rudeness as a method. Hurt feelings were of no importance to him. He always seemed to me to be a person who had nothing to lose. He was as nervy as anyone I have ever met." Although several different types of nuclear reactors were being designed, researched, and built at the lab, Alvin was most interested in creating a thorium breeder reactor that would not only create power, but also, at the same time, produce fuel to run the reactor, creating somewhat of a cycle of perpetuity. One of Alvin's early projects was to design a reactor that used liquid fuel instead of solid fuel. The first of these was the homogeneous reactor experiment. The HRE went into operation in 1950 and was affectionately called Alvin's 3P reactor because Alvin described it as using a pot, a pipe, and a pump. When the HRE went critical, Alvin pulled out a bottle of whiskey and told the crowd, "When piles go critical in Chicago, we celebrate with wine." when piles go critical in Tennessee, we celebrate with Jack Daniels. In addition to the reactor work at ORNL, Alvin found himself interested in other areas of science, looking not only at what could be accomplished in his lifetime, but also what needed to be done for future generations. In 1958, Alvin and Wigner co-authored the first nuclear textbook, The Physical Theory of Neutron Chain Reactors. The following year, in 1959, Alvin was one of the founders of the American Nuclear Society and was elected its first president. Alvin had the ability to look beyond the obvious and think of new and different ways to use nuclear technology. One of those ideas was to attach large nuclear plants to seawater evaporators. Some of the heat would be diverted to the evaporators, which separated water from salt, while the rest would generate electricity. The plants would serve a dual purpose, producing both fresh water and electricity. Alvin had become friends with Howard Baker, the junior senator from Tennessee. Baker lived about 50 miles from Oak Ridge and would visit the laboratory often. Alvin and Baker would frequently discuss the work being done at the lab. Baker was particularly enthusiastic about Alvin's idea to build dual-purpose nuclear desalting plants in the Middle East. Baker sponsored a Senate resolution which placed the U.S. Senate on record as supporting a study of nuclear desalting. The concept never materialized. The politics of building large nuclear reactors in the Middle East derailed the concept early in the process. However, Alvin continued to think of new ways to use this technology for mankind's benefit.
Weinberg was a real visionary. He saw things way out into the future and was a brilliant man.
One of the things that Alvin was interested in is having a bunch of reactors in an energy center. So you could have a cluster of 30 or 40 reactors on a site. And then you could also have a professional staff there that were doing research or doing something. But if there was ever a problem, you'd have a bunch of really well-educated people who could come and solve problems.
Alvin also became acutely aware of the issues, both in the present and in the future, related to nuclear waste. During the Atomic Energy Commission appropriation hearings in 1960, Alvin raised the issue of nuclear waste with Congress. He was very outspoken with his concerns, to the chagrin of many in Washington and in the nuclear industry. Alvin would later write that during his years at ORNL, he paid too little attention to the waste problem. He wrote, "Designing and building reactors, not nuclear waste, was what turned me on. I never acquired the instinctive, detailed understanding of the waste problem that I had of the reactor problem. I did not aggressively push the work on waste disposal at ORNL. As I think about what I would do differently, had I to do it over again, it would be to elevate waste disposal to the very top of ORNL's agenda."
And he was extraordinarily gifted in, I guess, science policy. He was one of the first science policy guys. And I think this was really his strength and where he made his major contributions. Although he also certainly played an important role in reactor design, but that was a technical issue. He was one of the early major players in concern, for example, about carbon dioxide and global warming, which now is a big deal in the world. Well, I kept hearing about it when I was 16.
While much of his time was taken up with running the laboratory and traveling as part of his duties, Alvin always felt Oak Ridge was home. Alvin and his wife Marge had 2 boys. David was the older brother to Richard. The Weinbergs lived in a modest home in the center of Oak Ridge.
Alvin was a little lax with us. In fact, probably laxer than he should have been. His father was a Russian immigrant, And his father was a tough son of a bitch who did not hesitate to use the belt when indicated. And Alvin was left, in some ways, probably arguably better off for it. I think a case could be made that his amazing powers of concentration might be not unrelated to that. But he resolved that he would absolutely not make that mistake with his children. And so he was a softie with his kids.
The Weinbergs did all their entertaining at home, which by today's standard must seem very, very unusual. And not only that, but as director of the lab, he probably entertained more Nobel Prize winners and more prominent people of science.
When not working, Alvin had two personal passions, playing the piano and playing tennis.
He had amazing powers of concentration. And something that I have to say I certainly resented at the time was he had this miraculous ability to tune out the kids. So, for example, he enjoyed playing the piano, and he would practice quite a lot at the piano. And David and I, one of our main pastimes when he was practicing was to try to distract him. And he was almost indistractable.
He loved his piano. He loved playing it. And I remember the day the new addition to the family came, the grand. And it's the way, I guess, some people can relate to getting the dream car of their choice. And that's what it felt like for Alvin to have received this piano, gone through the experience of going to New York, trying out Steinways, and suddenly realizing that he could have this piano, and he loved this piano.
He was a tennis fanatic. I found out later that apparently he never was all that good at the game, although he wasn't bad at it. But he apparently, one of his skills was longevity. And so he stayed healthy quite long. This was before the era of aerobics and watching your weight and so on. And so as he got older, he got better, not actually better, but, and so I believe he may have won some local prizes in the over 50 or over 60 category.
Being naturally inquisitive, Alvin was genuinely interested in what others thought about a variety of subjects.
Alvin, whenever he walked into a room, would immediately reach out his hand and say, "I'm Alvin Weinberg. What's your name? And what are you doing? That's very interesting. I want to hear all about it." He endeared himself by simple things we don't say to people, like we don't say to a plumber, "You're smart." Alvin could say that about someone came to fix some bricks in his walk and decided it needed to be trimmed. And Alvin said immediately, "You're so smart. We don't say that."
We were all in awe of him. So we were a little hesitant, I think, a lot of people in dealing with him. No, he was very warm, kind to people. He would talk to them. Once he was over here and my children were around and he talked to them, and afterwards they said, he asked a lot of questions. So even of young people, he was interested enough to find out what they thought about things.
Alvin approached me about it and just said, asked me what I thought about marijuana. He wanted to know, and since I was part of that social group. He just wanted to know what my thoughts were about it. Is it dangerous? Is it, should it be legalized or whatever? I think I volunteered the legalization thing, but I think he was curious about that. But what's significant is that in my youth, in my exuberance, and in my as a self-appointed authority, afterwards, I realized, I was talking like a fool to a man, much wiser than I was, who could not get enough of what I was saying to him.
By the early 1970s, Alvin found himself caught up in the politics of Washington and its control over the work being done at ORNL. Milton Shaw was the head of the Reactor Division for the Atomic Energy Commission, which had regulatory power over the national laboratories. Over the years, Alvin had become very much concerned with the safety of newer, larger reactors, a concern that he feared the AEC and nuclear industry did not share. Alvin found himself increasingly at odds with Shaw. Alvin said Shaw was like a bull, extremely hard-working, terribly demanding, single-minded. Alvin felt that it was becoming clear that Shaw had little confidence in him or in ORNL. That issue came to a head in 1972 when the Atomic Energy Commission held hearings on reactor safety.
For a number of years, the group I was in was doing reactor safety studies and basically fuel rod failure studies. What happens if something happens to the reactor? What happens to the cladding? And we had done a lot of work on that. And it turns out that neither the AEC nor the 4 reactor vendors liked our results. And especially Milton Shaw, who was also our funding agency. So anyway, the battle about emergency core cooling kept escalating, and finally DOE decided we'll settle it once and for all, we'll have a hearing.
Alvin knew the hearings would be a defining factor for the future of nuclear safety, so he gave instructions to his employees who had been called to testify at the hearings.
Alvin Weinberg did something that took most of the pressure off. He said, there are 2 things you have to do. And I thought, oh my gosh, is he going to give us a party line to follow? He said, you must act responsibly and tell the truth. And you don't have to worry about your jobs.
However, it wasn't long until Alvin's outspokenness and independent spirit became too much for Washington to handle.
Quite early, he got concerned about reactor safety. And I believe he ended up getting fired from his job at ORNL because he raised too many flags about reactor safety. This, of course, was before 3 Mile Island. But he was making himself a nuisance to the boosters in the Atomic Energy Commission, and there was a real son of a bitch who was in charge of who was the congressional guy in charge of the AEC, who didn't like these nattering nabobs of negativism.
Finally, late in 1972, Alvin was fired from his post at ORNL. Alvin had never been fired before. He said the shock was all the worse because only 3 years earlier, his wife Marge had died of cancer. However, Alvin was given an opportunity to take a leave of absence to soften the blow of being fired.
Alvin went on leave, and he'd been fired. I didn't know it. I don't think anybody would call up an absence of laboratory knew it.
Alvin would later express that leaving ORNL was the best thing that could have happened to him. He said, "My views about nuclear energy were at variance with those of Milt Shaw and others at the AEC. After all, it was I who had called nuclear energy a Faustian bargain, who continued to promote the molten salt breeder, and who tried to broaden the scope of ORNL by soliciting work from other agencies. I could reflect and write on the state of nuclear energy just as well, and perhaps better, were I no longer responsible for ORNL. After taking his leave of absence from ORNL, Alvin formed the Institute for Energy Analysis, an energy think tank. Although Alvin could have established the IEA at any number of locations across the country, he decided that he wanted to stay in Oak Ridge. Bill Pollard, the founding executive director of Oak Ridge Associated Universities, agreed to accept IEA as a component of ORAU. Alvin planned to begin IEA on January 1, 1974, as part of ORAU and with funding from the Atomic Energy Commission. But it wasn't long before Washington needed Alvin's help.
And then that was the point at which the oil embargo occurred, and the administration created an office, and I'm gonna have trouble with names, but it was responsible for the research on energy. And Alvin went up there and moved into a marvelous office in the executive office building and was in charge of that.
Alvin agreed to go to Washington for no more than 365 days to run the newly created Office of Energy Research and Development in the Federal Energy Office. However, still mourning the death of Marge 4 years prior, and having been fired from ORNL a year earlier, his year at the White House was anything but pleasant. Not long after arriving in Washington, Alvin found himself plagued by severe depression. He wrote, "My depression was partly the aftermath of my leaving ORNL, partly a continuing uncertainty, even 4 years after Marge's death, as to my personal life, and partly confusion in my own mind as to what in hell my Office of Energy Research and Development was supposed to do. Indeed, though my depression was not clinical, and most people did not notice it, I found it impossible to go through the day without popping several antidepressant Valiums. Suicidal thought beset me, but the closest I came on these were solitary walks along 23rd Street at night, half expecting, perhaps hoping, that I would be jumped by some tough guy." However, there was one bright spot during Alvin's year in Washington. On September 20th, Alvin married Jean Kellerman. Jean was a stockbroker in Oak Ridge, and she and Alvin had known each other for several years. At the end of the year, Alvin was invited by several government agencies to stay in Washington, but he decided it was time to go back home to Oak Ridge, where he finally started his work as director of the IEA, his energy think tank.
He was always looking for big picture kinds of things. He was an early advocate of civil defense. Then he became an advocate of missile defense systems, and he got quite interested in sort of strategic issues. And as with all these things, he would take these things seriously. So he talked to, former CIA people and people who really knew stuff about these things. And I remember he had a very interesting symposium under the auspices of ORAU about non-first use of nuclear weapons, I think.
I remember during that heat wave in New York when there were riots, and I don't remember the year it was, and sprinklers were open. They were forced to be open. And sitting watching that news with Alvin, he said, "You know what? Someday there'll be reactors to cool the streets, and then people won't have to fight with each other." He just had this strong passion that the technology which he so loved was just going to be the very best for everybody in the world.
I remember late in his life, before he retired completely from professional work, he started worrying about asteroids. And it's something you could almost laugh about, but he was serious and he meant it. And as it turns out, people having worked on it and motivated in part by his own work, it's not such a big deal. But until you find out, you don't know if it's a big deal.
Another area in which Alvin had great interest was that of global warming and climate change. He created a program to study the long-range effects of global warming on climate. He saw the carbon dioxide buildup as a powerful justification for reviving nuclear energy as a power source. This program was one of the first of its kind and became the basis for much of today's study of climate change. Alvin remained at ORAU until he retired in 1985 at the age of 70. As the 50th anniversary approached of the U.S. dropping atomic bombs on Japan, Alvin began to reflect on those fateful days during World War II. Alvin said he felt no remorse after the bombs were dropped, and that the euphoria over ending the war squelched any guilt that he might have felt. He said, "I think Hiroshima was necessary, not only to end the war, but also to demonstrate the awesome power of the atomic bomb. A demonstration in the desert could not create the kind of revulsion and taboo that I think now exists about the military use of the bomb. Only an awful event like Hiroshima could have done that." Oak Ridge was forever linked to the destruction of Hiroshima. Oak Ridge was, after all, where the uranium-235 was produced for the Little Boy bomb that was dropped on the Japanese city. As part of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the founding of Oak Ridge, a community organization decided to erect a replica of the Hiroshima Banshu bell in the center of town. Alvin was asked and agreed to chair the International Friendship Bell Committee. His main job as chair was to help raise the $150,000 needed for the bell.
He was saying, okay, to raise money, I have lots of well-known people around the world, and I write a letter to them, and I raise money. And even he said, I have a gold medal given my American Physical Society. I can sell it for $10,000. I'll give it.
The International Friendship Bell was eventually displayed in the center of Oak Ridge, but not without controversy. Alvin and his committee encountered opposition from some who regarded the bell as an unbecoming gesture of apology for Hiroshima, especially in view of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the vicious behavior of the Japanese military during the war. He said he tried to insist that the bell is not by way of apology, but as recognition of the connection between Oak Ridge and Hiroshima. More than that, it is a tangible, though small, step toward the sanctification of Hiroshima. He said, "For the bell will survive long after all the participants in the Manhattan Project and the objectors to apologizing to Japan have been forgotten. What will remain is this symbol. I hope it will become a shrine for the many visitors who, by their pilgrimage to the Friendship Bell, will be participating in the sanctification of Hiroshima and the permanence of the tradition of non-use." Upon his professional retirement in 1996, Alvin remained active. He played his piano, spent time with friends, and continued his lifelong passion of sharing his knowledge of and vision for the nuclear industry.
And even after he was retired and I was retired and I meet with him, I could expect questions about reactors that he would ask of me and of other people. And I realized I had to do some study sometimes, going and talk to him.
Although Alvin had been given many honors, one stood out from the rest. In 1980, Alvin was the recipient of the Enrico Fermi Presidential Award. The Fermi Award is one of the oldest and most prestigious science and technology honors bestowed by the U.S. government. However, Alvin felt that his awards and honors paled in comparison to some of the discoveries and groundbreaking work that had taken place in Oak Ridge. In particular, Alvin was proud of the role Oak Ridge had played in the production of medical radioisotopes. Alvin was frequently asked about Oak Ridge's greatest achievement. His response was always the same. He would say, "If at some time a heavenly angel should ask what the laboratory in the hills of East Tennessee did to enlarge man's life and make it better, I dare say the production of radioisotopes for scientific research and medical treatment will surely rate as a candidate for very first place."
In his later years, Alvin couldn't drive, and I used to take him to places and things. I spent a lot of time with him. And I walked into his house once. He was sitting by a wastebasket with a lap full of things. It was just throwing them in a wastebasket. Alvin, what are you doing? He said, I think it was 27 honorary degrees, and all of them keep me on their mailing list. And I get all this mail all the time. And he was throwing it away unopened. But that's an indication of how widely recognized he was, because he got a number of distinguished awards. And he was well known among the scientists at the time.
I drove with Alvin to a meeting in Gatlinburg in which he was to honor someone. And I wondered, at this point, how many young people really still remember Alvin, by then he was no longer director of the lab. He was getting along in years. Well, we were going up in the elevator to our rooms, and someone starts to walk out of the elevator, stops the elevator, and says, "Dr. Weinberg, I have always wanted to meet you all my life." To which Alvin says, "What's your name? I want to remember."
As an old man, he went back to piano and spent a lot of time in his last 10 years practicing, much more than he had because he had the free time. And it's really quite impressive how after he had lost most of his faculties and had trouble even, walking, he was really quite a good piano player. And it was a pleasure to see him doing it, and it was good music.
And he tried to be funny. He could not tell a joke. He could not tell a joke. He would try so hard. He said, "Come over here. I want to talk to you a minute." So I sat down on the couch next to him, and I was sort of thinking maybe he wanted to talk about the new high school because we were underway at that time. He asked me how I was doing, and I said I was doing really well. And he said, "I want to give you some advice as somebody who lost a spouse." And I said, "Well, that's nice. I'm anxious to hear what you have to say." And he said, "You need to get married again." And I was just sort of blown away. That was the last thing I expected him to say. But he said, "You really need somebody to share life with, and you need to get married again." So I said, okay. He was very fortunate in having two really exceptional women in his life. Both were different, but both were very strong. And actually, Jean continued the tradition of entertaining at home until she became ill.
He outlived his wife by only a couple of years. And that was his second wife, Jean. And his relationship with Jean was really sweet. They had a very good marriage, and they really liked each other. And they had made a pledge, apparently, I guess, when they started to age, that neither of them would live longer than the other one. She had a bad heart, and so she had a lot of trouble her last few years, and had a number of hospitalizations. And he would go with her to the hospital and either sleep in the same bed or the same room in the bed over, which I guess, I don't know whether this was routine or whether the hospital made a special arrangement for it.
And he loved this community. He could have lived anywhere in the world, gone anywhere in the world. He loved coming back to that F house. He could have built any house, anywhere, anywhere. And he died very quietly in his bed, in his bedroom, in the F house. He was all over the world. And yet every experience he had, that he was honored by a sultan, by a prince, by a maharaja, he was never anything but Alvin.
Alvin Weinberg died on October 18, 2006, at his home in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Those who knew him remember his passion, creativity, and inquisitive nature, always looking for the answer, always looking to make a difference, always looking toward the future. Evidence of his impact and contributions to science is reflected in the creation of the Alvin Weinberg Foundation. This British-based organization was created in Alvin's honor to advance the research, development, and deployment of safe, clean, and affordable nuclear energy. In the closing pages of his autobiography, The First Nuclear Era, The Life and Times of a Technological Fixer, Alvin Weinberg reflects on his life and career. He wrote, "For me, it has been a gloriously fulfilling life. I've received all of the highest honors bestowed for accomplishment in nuclear energy. I have received numerous honorary degrees. I've been president of the American Nuclear Society. As nuclear has fallen out of favor, I find that I no longer receive honorary degrees, let alone awards and prizes. But I cannot complain. My 50 years with nuclear energy have been filled with excitement, elation, disappointment, frustration, and fun. I have never regretted the fate that turned me from biophysics to nuclear energy."
All right, I think we're through.
Okay, very good.